The Hittite Vanishing. How the Bronze Age collapse erased the empire that defeated Egypt. What does it take to erase an empire that fought Egypt to a standstill? Not a slow decline, a disappearance. Within 50 years, the Hittites, one of antiquity's supreme powers, vanished so completely that the ancient world forgot they had ever existed. The Hittite Empire rose around 1600 BCE in what is now central Turkey and grew into one of the defining powers of the ancient Near East, a peer of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, not a footnote. 4 centuries of continuous rule. Their capital, Hattusa, sat on a rocky plateau in Anatolia, ringed by 6 kilometers of stone walls and housing up to 7,000 people. It contained temples, granaries, archives, and a royal palace complex that administered an empire across multiple languages. In 1274 BCE, Hittite king Muwatalli II met Pharaoh Ramesses II at Kadesh on the Orontes River, the largest chariot battle in recorded history. Neither side won decisively. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides were right to worry. That stalemate produced something extraordinary. The world's oldest known peace treaty, signed around 1259 BCE. Copies survive on clay tablets in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, a document so consequential that a replica hangs in the United Nations today. The Hittites weren't an isolated empire. They were a node in a dense international network, trading copper from Cyprus, grain from Egypt, tin from Afghanistan. Palace-based economies across the Eastern Mediterranean were interdependent in ways that look startlingly modern. Here's something that reframes everything you think you know about Bronze Age civilization. The Hittite legal code prioritized financial compensation over physical punishment. Lose an ox through negligence, you replace it. Their law ran closer to civil restitution than to Hammurabi's eye for an eye. And then it ends. Around 1200 BCE, within 50 years, the Hittite Empire ceases to exist. Hattusa is burned and abandoned. The palace archives go silent. An empire that corresponded directly with Pharaoh disappears without leaving a successor state. This isn't just a Hittite story. Within the same 50-year window, Mycenaean Greece collapses. The palace at Mycenae itself burns around 1190 BCE. Ugarit on the Syrian coast is destroyed and never rebuilt. On Cyprus, the palace center at Enkomi is abandoned by 1150 BCE. Egypt survives, barely, and shrinks dramatically. Multiple civilizations fall at once. Scholars have debated the cause for generations. Robert Drews, in his 1993 book, The End of the Bronze Age, argued that new infantry tactics overwhelmed chariot-based armies, a compelling thesis that explains military collapse but can't account for the simultaneous failure of inland agricultural systems. Eric Klein, in 1177 BC, later showed that every single cause theory, including Drew's invasion model, breaks down against the full evidence. The collapse is bigger than any one explanation. The most famous suspects are the Sea Peoples, a loose confederation of maritime raiders documented in Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III around 1177 BCE. Temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe them arriving by ship and by land, overwhelming coastal cities. But the Sea Peoples theory runs into trouble. The sites they're documented attacking, like Egypt, survived. The sites with no record of Sea Peoples contact, like inland Hittite Hattusa, also collapsed. Raiders explain coastal destruction. They don't explain a systemic implosion. A second line of evidence comes from tree rings. Dendrochronology, reading climate history from annual growth rings in ancient timber, has produced striking results for the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. The rings tell a story of prolonged drought. Tree ring evidence from the region shows a significant aridification event spanning roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, precisely the collapse window. Harvests fail, grain stores deplete. A Hittite king's letter to Egypt, preserved on clay, explicitly begs for emergency grain shipments. The famine was real. That letter is one of the most haunting documents from the ancient world. A Hittite king, the name on the tablet is damaged, writes to the pharaoh describing his people dying from hunger. He isn't making a diplomatic request. He's pleading. The tablet was never sent. But drought alone doesn't explain the speed. Civilizations have survived comparable droughts before. Old Kingdom Egypt endured the 4.2 kilo-year aridification event around 2200 BCE and eventually reconstituted itself. What made the 1200 BCE drought catastrophic was a third factor. The Bronze Age international system was so tightly interdependent that when one node failed, the shock propagated instantly across the entire network. Palace-based economies in the Bronze Age didn't function like modern markets. The palace collected surplus, redistributed it, and coordinated long-distance trade. Remove the palace, and there's no fallback, no private market, no alternative supply chain. Consider bronze itself. Bronze requires tin, and the Hittites had almost none domestically. Tin traveled thousands of kilometers from sources in Afghanistan and possibly Central Europe. Disrupt those supply routes through drought, raiding, or political instability, and the entire military-industrial base of the empire seizes up. Ugarit, the great Syrian trading port, offers the sharpest case study. Archaeologists found a clay tablet in the ruins describing an enemy fleet attacking the coastline, a letter that was being fired in the kiln when the city was destroyed. The warning arrived with the catastrophe. When Ugarit fell, it severed one of the Hittite Empire's primary trade arteries. That palace-based economy with no redundancy, Ugarit was the port through which Hittite goods reached the Mediterranean. Losing it wasn't an inconvenience, it was a systemic amputation. At Hattusa itself, the destruction layer is revealing. The city was burned, but signs of gradual abandonment precede the fire. Valuables removed, archives partially cleared. This wasn't purely a sudden sack. Someone knew it was coming and started packing. Which raises a question historians rarely ask loudly enough. Where did the Hittites go? An empire of hundreds of thousands of people doesn't simply cease to exist. They dispersed and left traces that went unidentified until 1906, when German archaeologist Hugo Winkler excavated Hattusa and recognized the cuneiform archive for what it was: the records of a lost superpower. Across southern Anatolia and northern Syria, smaller Hittite-descended city-states, Carchemish, Malatya, Zinkerli, kept using Hittite hieroglyphic script and Hittite artistic conventions for centuries after Hattusa burned. The empire ended, the culture didn't entirely. For nearly 3,000 years, the Hittites were so thoroughly forgotten that they survived only as a minor name in the Hebrew Bible. It wasn't until Hugo Winkler's 1906 excavations at Hattusa, where he uncovered over 10,000 cuneiform tablets, that scholars recognized they'd found one of the ancient world's great empires hiding under the Anatolian plateau. Here's the payoff. Drought, sea peoples, and trade collapse weren't competing explanations. They were sequential triggers in a single cascading system. Drought stressed the food supply. Raiders exploited the instability. Trade disruption cut off the resource flows that could have funded recovery. Each stress made the next one worse. Complexity theorist Yanir Baryam at the New England Complex Systems Institute has used the Bronze Age collapse as a textbook case of network fragility under compound stress. His finding: systems that strip out redundancy to maximize efficiency become catastrophically brittle the moment multiple nodes fail at once. The Hittites weren't uniquely weak. They were uniquely optimized, and optimization, taken far enough, becomes a liability. Economists and complexity theorists have returned to the Bronze Age collapse repeatedly as a model case. Systems that optimize for efficiency by stripping out redundancy become catastrophically brittle under compound stress. The Hittites weren't uniquely weak. They were uniquely connected. The Hattusa Archive, over 10,000 clay tablets recovered by Winkler and later excavators, preserved not just the peace treaty, but diplomatic correspondence, legal codes, and religious texts in 8 languages. That archive is why we know anything about the Hittites at all. When the scribal school burned, the chain of transmission broke. The Hittites show how completely a civilization can vanish from memory without every artifact being destroyed. Hattusa housed a scribal school, the institution that trained the only people who could read and copy cuneiform. When that school burned, the reading stopped. Within 2 generations, no one living could interpret the tablets stacked in the ruins. Memory doesn't survive the destruction of the institutions that carry it. The Hittites also show how completely a civilization can be erased from historical memory without physical destruction of every artifact. They were forgotten not because all evidence was destroyed, but because the literate class that transmitted their history ceased to function. Memory requires institutions. The collapse that erased the Hittites inaugurated a Mediterranean Dark Age lasting roughly 4 centuries. Writing systems disappeared in Greece. Long-distance trade contracted to a fraction of its Bronze Age volume. The world that emerged around 800 BCE had to rebuild complexity largely from scratch. We opened by asking what it takes to erase an empire. The answer isn't one catastrophe. It's 3 moderate stresses hitting a system with no slack left in it, simultaneously. The Hittites didn't fail because they were weak. They vanished because the world they'd built was too efficient to survive being broken. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more.